Welcome to the lecture on reinforcement learning and the brain. In this video, I will talk about coarse brain anatomy and how it relates to reinforcement learning. We will stay on a rather coarse level. Overall, reinforcement learning needs a representation of states, a representation of action and a way to select action, and it needs reward signals. So, where are states encoded in the brain? Where is action selection encoded in the brain? How is reward encoded in the brain? These are questions which we'll address shortly. Overall, the brain is organized in different areas. On the left, we have a frontal area, parietal cortex, occipital cortex. The cortex, I should say, consists of a sheet of neurons, densely packed neurons, and the sheet is folded, and the biggest folds mark the separations between the different cortical areas. That's an anatomical view. A more interesting view maybe for us is a functional view. So an area at the end of the brain, on the back of the brain, is involved in vision. In fact, there are several visual areas. Then here is a motor-related area, motor cortex M1, primary motor cortex. Here are sensory representations of touch. Over there is audition. And this is again the cortex. Now, below the cortex, there are additional areas, and these are organized in small clusters of neurons called brain nuclei. And some of these neurons send out dopamine signals, in particular the VTA, which sits right here, and the substantia nigra next to it. Interesting for us is dopamine is related to reward, to surprise, to pleasure. Dopamine is an important signal for reinforcement learning, as we will see later. Let's look a little bit more on some of these nuclei. So the striatum sits below cortex. It is part of the basal ganglia, and this striatum is involved in action selection, in decisions. Some people say it's also involved in planning. So this is an interesting area for us as well. We could look in the details of the striatum. So it's subdivided in different areas. There's a caudate part, there's the putamen part, which itself, both of them have additional substructures. And this nucleus accumbens in mammals is also called the ventral striatum, or it's part of the ventral striatum. Important for us, it's just striatum is involved in action selection. Now let's go again below the cortex. There are other areas, and let's go below the cortical surface. There are other areas, and down here sits the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is part of temporal cortex and sits below it. It is involved in memory. In particular, for us, it's involved in spatial memory. Now, what is spatial memory? It means knowing where you are right now, or knowing how to navigate in an environment. So, since hippocampus is involved in spatial memory, it's a candidate to represent the position where we are. That means to represent the current state. Another important candidate for our relation between the brain and reinforcement learning. Now, all these representations are not fixed because the brain can adapt during use. And I just want to give you two examples. I said that in an area over here, area 3 labeled here on the image, in this area we present the cortical surface. And in particular, the hand is represented. Now it turns out that for fingers, more space is allocated in musicians than in non-musicians. Obviously, they are not born as musicians, but it's because of their daily practice that the brain decides to devote more space, a better representation of the state space of the current situation, the current position of the fingers on the strings, on the piano keys, and so forth. Similarly, the hippocampus is involved in spatial representations, and now it turns out that London taxi drivers, at the time before the GPS came up, London taxi drivers had a bigger hippocampus than London bus drivers. And that's because they have to know where they are, they have to plane in the space. So the state representation itself is not given, but it is learned. And that's another aspect that we will use later in this series of lectures. So we said reinforcement learning needs a representation of states, the where, the sensory input. Candidates for us are the hippocampus, maybe also the sensory cortex. Reinforcement learning needs action selection. Good candidates are the striatum and maybe also the motor cortex. The reinforcement learning framework needs reward signals. A good candidate is the dopamine signals that are sent out from deep nuclei in the brain. So we have candidate brain areas and candidate brain signals that we can relate to reinforcement learning. Let's finish this part with a little quiz to get the terminology straight. If I say cortex, I mean the same as the brain. The two are synonyms, and this is wrong. The cortex consists of several areas. Yes, that is correct. Some areas are specialized and more involved in vision, others more in the representation of the body surface. Again, this is correct. Below the cortex, inside the brain, there are groups of neurons, clusters of neurons. And yes, this is correct. Hippocampus sends out dopamine signals. Well, that's wrong. But BTA and nucleus accumbens send out dopamine signals, and that is correct. So for us, what is important is dopamine is linked to reward, pleasure, and surprise. Yes. Striatum is involved in action selection. Yes. Hippocampus is involved in the representation of where and therefore in state representation.